here are all the materials we'll need to get started. You'll see here I have a 100% acrylic blanket. I'll also have cotton blankets linked below, but I actually prefer acrylic for this project. I also have my yarn. This is I Love This yarn in the color 20 Ivory. This is a weight 4 yarn, and you can tell on the back because there is a little skein here and it says medium weight 4, and that's my favorite for this project. I wouldn't go anything higher than that or it'll get a little too just a little too fuzzy. And then I have my template I've printed out here on 3 sheets of Sulky Stick and Stitch. I'll have all the links down below. And then needles, these are large eye tapestry needles. Make sure they have a sharp point to get through the sulky. And then some extras you may or may not need are a water-soluble pen. You could also use Crayola washable, and of course a pair of scissors. So let's go ahead and get started by putting the template on our blanket. Now these templates run about 32 inches wide, about 33 inches wide because we have 3 sheets of paper, but I overlap them about a ½ inch on each sheet. And this is because most toddler blankets are 30 inches wide. So I'm using a 30 inch by 40 inch blanket here, and I'm just kind of laying out where my duck pattern will fall on it, but I'm working on the 30 inch side. So you'll see here that the template is plenty long enough to cover a 30 inch blanket. And we're going to start by taking off the first page. So you'll see here they're numbered at the bottom, page 1. And we're going to take off that first sheet of our sulky. So these are sticky, so it'll stick right to our blanket. And I like to line it up exactly with the bottom and the side of the blanket just to make sure it's really, really, tight and even with the blanket spacing. And that's why I like to use acrylic because it doesn't stretch as much as cotton. Now this is where things get interesting when we start on page 2, because you're going to have to overlap the sulky a little bit to make sure that the pattern lines up. And you'll see here even I screwed it up. So I'm trying to line up these lines at the top with the duck bill and the line at the bottom, but I forgot to line up the actual overlap. So you'll see here my overlap is actually a little crooked and it's not lined up with the bottom of the blanket. You'll see me actually kind of step back and realize that it's not lined up. I'm just filming so close up I didn't see it. So make sure you line up with the bottom of the blanket too. Mine clearly wasn't lined up, so I'm going to take it off and just kind of line that up a bit better. You can also use a ruler to measure the overlap because the overlap should be completely even from top to bottom. It's about a ½ inch to an inch on both sheets of overlap. So make sure those lines line up, it's lined up with the bottom, and that duck bill is completely overlapping on the first and second sheet. So I think that looks good. It's a little off, but it will still look cute in the end when we finish it. This third one's definitely the hardest with this tail, but I find it actually helps to overlap the tail perfectly here, and then lining up those lines at the top and the bottom. This page is closer to about an inch, maybe an inch and a half of overlap, but you'll see you have about an inch or 2 of overlap on the edge of the blanket as well. So that means you could even go further to the left or have a slightly larger blanket, but I kind of like having that overlap on the end. So now you'll see me come in with a water-soluble marker, and I'm just kind of going to go over any of these lines that aren't super crisp or clear, just because, again, the printer won't print all the way to the edge. And this is just for me. You should be able to see them on one or the other pages, but sometimes they kind of just don't show through. So I'm just kind of cleaning up some of those lines. I'm also going to mark on the edges where I want it to stop. So I don't like going over that ribbing on the left and right of the blanket. I just think it looks a little odd when you go over it. That's personal preference though. Feel free to do what you want. So this is definitely the hardest part, is getting this template on the blanket because I want to make sure it looks perfect and everything is super even and clean. So once you're happy with it, we can go ahead and get started. Now to start, I'm going to take one of my needles and I'm going to thread about 12 feet of yarn onto this needle. It's going to be a lot, but you want to make sure you have the most amount of yarn you can handle because you're going to be going through about 100 feet of yarn to make this entire blanket, and the less ends I have to weave in at the end, the better. So I found 12 feet is about what I can handle for one blanket. You're also going to be doing about a foot on each end as the tail, so really you're only working with about 12 to 11 feet of yarn. But I have 12 feet threaded on my needle here, and I'm going to zoom in close. You'll notice I'm starting on the left of my blanket because I'm a righty. I find it's easier to kind of control the excess amount of blanket by starting on the left, but if you're a lefty, it might make sense to start on the right. You'll also see me coming up here outside of the sulky, and that's just because I really want to start on that ribbing outside of the blanket. I like to think of the ribbing of the blanket as kind of like my picture frame. So I like to start my embroidery right on the inside of it. So that's why I'm pulling it up here. And you'll also notice I keep about a foot of yarn outside on the tail, and that's what we're going to weave in later. So that's why I said you're now working with 11 feet of yarn, is because that 1 foot is getting left out. But we're going to start going down through that same hole we just created and come up. I measured it out. It's about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch for my chain stitches here. Use what you think looks great. I know a lot of people in Europe said a centimeter works perfectly well for them. To me, it's about 3/8 of an inch, which is just in between that 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. I'll show you a tip here in a little bit of how to make your stitches super even, but to keep continuing that stitch, you're going to go down through that same hole and then come up again about 1/8 of an inch away in this case, and pull it through. Always make sure you're staying on the line of the duck. This is the line we're going to trace the entire time. And another tip I'm going to give you is always go to the right or the left of your yarn. In this case, I'm always going to the right of the yarn when I go down in that hole, and that just makes it so my chain stitches don't get all twisted and they stay really flat and even. This just creates a super even, consistent line. And when I'm pulling through, I stop once I feel any bit of resistance. So again, going down in that hole to the right of the yarn, coming up about 1/8 of an inch away, pulling it through, making sure I'm getting stuck in that loop, and pulling it through all the way until I feel just a slight bit of resistance. This is very tedious, and I'm going to go through a few more stitches because this is the only stitch we use in this entire project. I noticed my tail was coming off slightly there, so just threading it back so I don't have to rethread my needle. And I'm just going to keep showing you a few more chain stitches, and then I'm going to give you one tip for keeping your stitches super even. So I'm just going to fast forward a little bit through this so you get the chain stitch idea. And now I'm going to clean off my nail, and I'm going to take a Sharpie, and I'm just going to mark off lines on my nail. You could also do it on the skin to the right of your thumb, wherever you find works best. And again, this is about 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch I found works perfect. But now I can show you how to use this. So now when you go down to the right of that yarn with your needle, you can bring it up and use that spacing on your nail to get the perfect spacing. So notice how I'm lining up one of the lines with the top of the yarn and the second line with the needle. That's how you make sure all of your stitches are even. So you can use this technique the entire time if you'd like, or just kind of eyeball it if you get the hang of keeping your stitches even. But I just find that keeps the project super clean and tidy when you can keep your stitching even and your tension even. That's going to be the main key to this project, is even tension and even stitches. So I'm just going to continue this chain stitch until I get to the tail of the duck. Now when I get to the tail, I actually notice that my yarn is starting to unravel a little bit. So if your yarn ever starts to look like this when you're doing a project, that just means it's coming untwisted. That happens because yarn isn't really made for embroidery. We kind of just started using it. So if this ever happens, I just like to retwist it by threading my needle or twisting my needle in a clockwise direction. So my yarn is twisting clockwise, so I'm going to turn my needle clockwise and just kind of make sure the twist goes all the way to the beginning of that yarn. So now when I pull you in, you'll notice my yarn is nice and twisted up again, and that's kind of the twist I'm looking for. You could also look at your original yarn skein to make sure it lines up with that. But now we can go ahead and finish off this tail, and I like to make a really sharp point here, so I'm actually going to go down through the fabric to tie off this chain stitch. And I'm going to go ahead and pull that through, and you'll notice I'm about 1/8 of an inch away again from that last chain stitch. Again, this is just creating a really sharp point to that tail just so it looks really super cute, but we're not going to cut off our yarn or anything else. We're going to keep going with that same piece of yarn through to the next tail. So to do that, I'm going to come back up through that last chain stitch I did. Make sure you're not going through the yarn or anything, or that will look a little funny. Just make sure you're right in the middle of that chain stitch and then pull it all the way through. Again, don't pull too tight. Once you feel any resistance, stop. And now we can continue on through this loop. And I'll give you one technique for doing this tight loop here once we get to it. But to continue this chain stitch, we're just going to go inside that last chain stitch and then come up outside it. So that's one way to connect chain stitches. You could keep going without stitching it down, but I just find it starts to pull up and it looks a little funny. So I like to stitch it down there. When I get to this loop now, and you are going to be doing a tighter loop, I'm actually going to lean closer to that 1/8 inch stitching so that my stitches are really close together. This just makes it so that the stitching doesn't look kind of like a staircase. It'll look a little smoother by doing smaller stitches. If you've ever taken a math calculus class, that's exactly what we're doing here, is just trying to do smaller stitches to make it more look like a curved line and less like a staggered line. But you'll just notice me taking smaller and smaller sections as I go around these little loops so that it looks a little cleaner. And you'll notice I'll take a loop, I'll pull through my chain stitch, and then I'll kind of twist the blanket around. This just kind of helps me always make it so that my stitching is going away from me. It's just what I find to be most comfortable, but you do you, whatever you find most comfortable for your stitching. But again, smaller stitches around the loops, and that just makes it look cleaner, smoother and less like a staircase. And the next thing we want to go over is how to go over the previous yarn. Since you'll see here, we're about to have to go over our original chain stitch. So I'm going to show you how I handle that here in a second, but and then my camera, I'm not even in focus. There you go, Anna. So again, just pulling those stitches through 1/8 of an inch. This is a very tedious project, I'm not gonna lie, but the results are so cute and so worth it. And I find once you get a hang of the chain stitch, it really comes together quickly. So now, again, I'm just kind of readjusting my blanket. You're gonna be doing this a lot. I'm 1 chain stitch length away from that chain stitch. So we can overlap our chain stitches now. And to do that, I'm gonna go down through that previous chain stitch, just like we've been doing, but I'm gonna come up in the middle of the chain stitch. Always come up in the middle, and then we can go back down and come up outside it. I find this is the best way to overlap a chain stitch and make it look really clean and not just go completely over it. I find when I just go completely over it and try to skip the chain stitch, it just looks a little funny. So again, just showing you here that I'm going in the middle of the chain stitch when I'm pulling through. If I just try to jump over that chain stitch, it's just too far of a gap and it just looks a little funny. So I always like to come up through that middle of the chain stitch. And there you have it. Now, this should be around the time where you start to realize you're running out of yarn. I should have stopped a long time ago. I like to stop when I have about 12 inches of yarn or about 1 foot of yarn, but I didn't. So you're gonna see me here putting my needle down into the blanket, keeping my thumb so that I keep that loop up top. Then I'm just gonna take that yarn off my needle completely and I'm going to thread up another 12 feet of yarn. So this is how you're going to continue your chain stitch the entire way, where nobody will notice where your yarn stopped and where it started, because there's no way you can embroider with 100 feet of yarn. That's ridiculous. So you will have to do this at least 6 or 7 times in this project, so make sure you get comfortable with this process. This is me just threading, again, another 12 feet of yarn onto my needle. And since I have that loop up top, we're just gonna start the next chain stitch by coming up through the back. Again, that same distance away, in my case about 3/8 of an inch, and I'm gonna pull that through all the way, and then I'm gonna loop it through that chain stitch. So now pull it all the way through until you have about 1 foot of yarn on the back. And I'm gonna show you what the back looks like. So you're gonna get a lot of these little tails on the back. So now you'll see I have about 12 inches of yarn on the back to work with to tie in later, and that's exactly what I want. I'm actually going to grab both of these now and I'm going to pull them so that that little loop will kind of start going down and down. And I'm going to keep pulling those yarn pieces on the back until I am happy with that chain stitch. And again, don't pull too tight. Once it kind of lines up with the rest of the chain stitches around it, that's where you can stop. But make sure you hold those yarns on the back for at least the first few stitches just to keep them in place, because you do run the risk of kind of pulling that yarn through and ruining that last chain stitch you created. So these next few chain stitches I'm going to be very careful with, go slowly, and just kind of make sure they look good. I might pull this yarn a little more tight there just so it looks even and you can't see where I started and stopped, but then I can keep going once I have that done. And then again, the rest of this will be pretty straightforward. The eye of the duck will be similar to what you did for that first loop on the tail, and then the duck bill will be very similar to what you did on the tail with that sharper point. So let's come back when you get to the bottom of the duck and we have to overlap those chain stitches. So you're going to keep chain stitching until you get about to the middle of the bottom of the duck. So I'm going to stop at about this point and then start overlapping my stitches and then continue the chain stitch. So I actually went a little too far before overlapping, so I should have started about 4 or 5 chain stitch lengths back to start overlapping. But I'm just going to start here, start overlapping my stitches, and you'll notice I just slowly kind of peek through until this stitch where I go inside that chain stitch. I want about 6 to 8 chain stitch lengths over that original line to make it look really cohesive, like the duck is kind of floating on the water and not just a part of the water. I don't know if that makes sense, but you're going to do about 6 or 8 where you're actually chain stitching over the original chain stitch, again aiming for the holes of that bottom chain stitch length. I only did about 5 here. I probably should have done a few more. 6 to 8 is kind of the sweet spot I find of making the duck look good, but alas, I'm out of the chain stitch now. I'm starting the second line, and this is everything you need to do pretty much the entire blanket. So you're going to continue doing the entire blanket, doing this stitch and all those tips I told you for the tails and the small loops the entire way. The ducks just get a little bit smaller, so it gets a little trickier. So I'm going to come back when we're almost at the end, and then we can finish it off together. So have fun with your stitching, try to relax and enjoy it, because it is a lot of work, but it is relaxing and it should be fun. So come back when you're at the end. Now, I'm not gonna lie, that took me about 3 to 4 hours to do. I stopped counting after a while, but this is where you wanna come back. So I'm at this section and I'm starting to realize that I do not have enough yarn to finish off this entire segment. So I have about 8 inches left of line work to do, and I'm realizing I don't have enough yarn to do. So at this point in the duck, if you realize you don't have enough yarn to do, and I'm gonna show you a trick here in a minute for determining if you have enough yarn to finish it off. If you don't, you should stop immediately and re-thread your yarn. So here I'm showing you that if I were to lay out my yarn, it should go back and forth 3 times. So it should go to the end, back up to the duck, and then back to the end, counting for 3 times. If your yarn does not do that, you're not going to have enough length to get through it. So you see me here kind of trying to show you it going there once, and it doesn't even make it halfway back. Now it should go all the way and still have a foot of yarn left on your needle to get through that. That's about the length I found that you need to do this. If you don't even have anywhere close to that, just tie it off, because you do not want to get to the end and realize you don't have enough yarn, because it is such a pain to tie off for just like 2 or 3 inches. So I would rather you just tie off now and restart with a fresh piece of yarn if you don't think you have enough. I definitely don't have enough, so I'm just going to start with a new fresh piece of yarn. This is about 5 feet of yarn, which is way too much for this length, but I'd rather have too much than too little. Again, just doing kind of that technique to thread on a new piece of yarn so you can't see where it starts or stops. That way I can finish off my duck, get to the end of the blanket, and nobody will be none the wiser that I ran out of yarn right towards the end. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. But again, if you get to this point where you're finishing off the duck head and you don't think you have enough yarn to finish, just stop and start with a new fresh piece of yarn. Trust me, you will thank me. I have made this mistake one too many times in the dozens of these blankets I have made. So let's go finish this off. And we finally did it. We're at the end. We've been stitching for hours and we can finally put down our last stitch. So you'll see me coming in here. I just want to make sure again that I'm very, very even on that ribbing. And I'm right at the end, so I can stitch this down and finish off my blanket. Almost. We're almost finished. So stitch this down and you are completely done with the duck outline. Now you'll flip over your blanket and you'll realize you have probably a dozen or so yarn ends that you have to weave in. Now this is the one tip that you cannot skip. Please do not tie these off with little knots. Little ones are notorious for untying those. So we're going to do a whipped back stitch on the back of this blanket. I am going to show you it here. I am going to use the sharp point of the needle and we're just going to go in and out of every single stitch on the back. So notice how I'm skipping a stitch and then going through and pulling it through. This is called a whipped back stitch. I always like to go either left to right or right to left. In this case, I'm going left to right, making it kind of like a DNA helix type of look on the back. But again, this just kind of ties in your ends so that little ones can't unpick it. Because this is a blanket and it's going to get a lot of wear and tear and people are going to see the back of it, this is really essential for making the back of your blanket look clean and cohesive and like it's not a knotty mess on the back. Is this time consuming? Yes, this probably took me another 20-30 minutes just to weave in all the ends, but I promise it's worth it for the finished look of your blanket to make it look very professional. I'm going to continue this process for about 2 to 3 inches worth of space. That equates to about 15 to 20 like actual stitches for each yarn end. I'm usually a little crazy and I like to just do more. I'd rather it be more secure than less. So the more you can do, the better. You are going to get to a point though where you're overlapping your yarn spacing, and I'll show you that in a minute. So just be cognizant of your other yarn ends you have to weave through and the space you need to weave them through. I don't know if that makes sense, but it'll make sense in a minute. So I'm just going to keep showing you this whipped back stitch and how far I go and how long it's taking me, but I promise it's going to be so worth it in the end. So I think I'm going to do about 2 or 3 more stitches and then we can tie it off. I think that looks good. Okay. Past Anna says that looks good, so we're going to cut it off and call it a day here. Now just do this for every single other piece of yarn that's floating around. Now I am going to show you that when I get to a spot, such as these kind of loops, I will follow the loops to a T. So if I get to the duck eye, I will follow that loop to a T when I'm doing the whipped back stitch, and same with these little loops here. I don't kind of just skip around it. I find that it just makes it look a little better if I do that. And if you get to a point where you have 2 ends that are close to each other, I actually go the opposite direction. So the side on the left will get whipped back stitched to the right and vice versa. So I'm doing the yarn on the right now and I'm going to whip back stitch it to the left. Again, this is just a tiny little thing I have so that you don't really see that gap in the yarn, and it kind of just looks like a cohesive line on the back, and you're kind of just getting a reverse image of the duck. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it makes sense to me, and it just makes it a little more professional looking in the end, so I just do this all the time. I always just kind of flip those yarns. My yarns are stuck here, so I'm going to have to cut those, but always just flip them. Now, once you weave in all those ends, you're going to come back to the beginning and realize you still have to do the wings. It's the last and final step, I promise. And I just noticed that I couldn't really see some of these wings here, so I am taking my marker just to kind of redraw them back in. This has been a project over multiple weeks, honestly, so my ink has started to fade. You hopefully shouldn't have to do this, but my ink faded, so I'm just kind of redrawing in those lines so I can see it a little better. Now, since we have about 4 wings to do, I am going to show you the smaller wings because I think they're a little harder to handle. I'm going to use about 2 feet of yarn for each of these wings though. And the same thing though, you're just going to be doing a chain stitch along all of these little wings. It doesn't matter if you start left to right here. I just always make it a personal preference of mine to always go from the back of the duck to the front. I don't know why. You do you. It's just something I always do. I just like that they all go in the same direction. So if you start head to tail, do that for each and every single duck. So I'm going to start tail to head here, and I'm just going to do that same chain stitch the entire length of the duck wing. Again, keeping that tail in the back. You'll only need about 6 inches of tail in the back for these little wings. But again, if you have too much, I'd rather have more than not enough. So again, simple chain stitch all the way to the end. I'm not going to show you that. And then you can just stitch it down here on the end of the duck. What I am going to show you though is how to do the whipped back stitch on these tiny little wings, because you do not have 2 inches of space to do it for both sides. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to flip this over, and I'm going to do a whipped back stitch all the way to the second piece of yarn, and then I'm going to take the second piece of yarn and go all the way back to the front. So they're going to overlap. So I did 1 whipped back stitch all the way to the front. That's what you see me here cutting off. And then I'm going to take this next piece of yarn and I'm going to go all the way back to the front. So it's technically going to be like a doubled up whipped back stitch. It's going to be pretty thick, but this is the only way I found to keep these duck wings really secure and flat. So it might be a little harder to pull through, and that's fine. Honestly, that's what you want. You want that tension so that these yarns do not come undone. I've never had an issue with these blankets coming undone. I do have an issue with the fact that I did not leave out enough of a tail here to do my whipped back stitch. So this is my own fault. Be better than me. Leave out more than 6 inches of yarn. This is probably only 4 inches I'm working with, so it's going to be a pain for me, but I wanted to show you this because even I do make mistakes, and I'm just showing you that it's going to be a little bit harder to use a smaller piece of yarn, but I did want to show you this just so you know that it's okay if you make mistakes and to work through it. If you don't have enough yarn, you may have to just cut it out and retry, but I'm going to make do because I am stubborn, so I'm going to keep going with this tiny little bit of yarn, hanging on for dear life and trying to just do this whip back stitch. So you'll notice I kind of skipped a few here for the second piece. As long as you get six or so stitches in, I find it holds up very well. Don't even worry about it. But there you have it. Finish off all your wings and you are officially done with this project. Like I said, it's a very long project, but it is so cute in the end. So next steps are going to be to get the stabilizer off. You can usually either throw it in the wash, which is what I'm going to do on a cold, delicate cycle. But if you don't have a washing machine, you can run it under the faucet for about 10 to 15 minutes. So go do that and come back. Now I just laid this blanket on the ground to dry flat. I did not put it in the dryer. I find putting things in the dryer tends to warp them a little bit, so I try to avoid it at all costs. But this is our finished blanket. I'm so obsessed with this design, and I know you guys are too. It is my most viral blanket of all time, and everybody always wants to see the inside. I was pretty impressed with that, not gonna lie. So this is what the inside or the back should look like. It should be super clean because we did that whipped back stitch, so there should be no knots to hurt baby's skin. You may see some places where the yarn kind of starts to fray because you washed it. That's totally fine. I promise. I've had some of these blankets for years and they do not come undone with this whipped back stitch. It is by far the best stitch to use. Anyway, thank you guys all for spending some time with me today. I would love to see your finished blankets. Happy stitching, and make sure you follow and like this video for more. Bye.